Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And for those of you who've taken AP European history, or those of you who are just interested in European politics or British politics, you may or may not know that there's a I tell you what, I need to make sure to mute this. Sorry about that. Let's go ahead and try that again. Okay, so I'm hearing my delayed echo. But with that, if you're into European politics, British politics, or current news in general, that there is an election going on in Britain. It is for the European Parliament. Okay, so it's not for the UK Parliament, but the election that's going to happen this week is an election for the European Parliament. Now, you may ask yourself, well, didn't they vote to leave the European Union like almost 3 years ago? Why are they having elections for the European Parliament? But remember that Britain is still not out from the EU, even though they voted, they've been negotiating an agreement. Britain is still part of the EU. And we've got to think about what are the implications of this election and where does Brexit stand right now? And what are some of the future implications? Now, we try to do this on average about once a year or so. And I'm joined once again by Mr. Colin Baker from Blacksburg High School, who is a native of Scotland, even though, he is, he's an American now, and we're glad to have him. But he always brings forward a great perspective. And we're going to try to kind of hash out just some of the things about Brexit. What are the advantages and disadvantages? Who are the players here? What is the difference between a hard Brexit, a soft Brexit? What's the backstop? So I'm going to hand it to you for a second, Colin. You can tell us about your background and what you bring to the table here.
Yeah, so like Tom, I teach AP Euro as well, and Blacksburg High School is in Southwest Virginia, which is a rural part of Appalachia, but it has a big college campus. So we have a lot of knowledgeable parents, knowledgeable families, and many different nationalities actually in our school. So and like me, a lot of my students have dual nationality or have second generation. Not so many from Europe, but certainly we're aware of this whole idea that you can have a dual nationality. You can have two identities. You don't just have to have one allegiance in terms of nationality. And that's definitely relevant here in Brexit and in the European elections and what makes a person European. The elections aren't just in Britain. They're taking place over 3 days in all of Europe, all of the EU, 28 countries. So that's coming up on May 23rd. That's starting. So a few days from now.
Yeah, and one of the things, Colin, that's always confused me, okay, is that I've been to Britain. Specifically, I've been to London. So I don't know. People who are from Britain may say that I've gotten a very, very limited view. But I've been to London, and also I've been to Europe. And of course, I can definitely understand why, the Netherlands is in the European Union, why Belgium would be in the European Union, why France would be in the European Union. That makes sense to me because I've got the same plug-in adapters for those countries. I can move back and forth between those countries. Everything is in metric. And that's one thing I remember before I went to Britain, everybody said like, oh, the British don't use the imperial system of measurements. And then you find out, you go over there and it's like colloquially miles, feet, pints, and all of this. And of course, the British have their own electrical outlets that I believe one of my students was telling me the British take great pride in these outlets. They say that they're much safer than the outlets that are used in Europe and the United States. So if I'm in France or I'm in Turkey, the outlets are the same, they're the same thing. And so then I go to Britain and they're different. Of course, then the British, speak English. So, I almost, part of me wonders, of course, it's my American perspective, wouldn't they be better off in the Anglosphere? You think about like 1984 in that book, Britain is actually part of the same totalitarian, like third of the world with North America. And so, that kind of, of course, they're the second largest economy in Europe. And I guess one of the things that gets me is I wonder sometimes, is Britain even part of the European Union today, because they've got their own currency. They're not part of the Schengen area. So if I'm traveling between the Netherlands and Britain, I still have to go through customs. And so really, I wonder, like, to what extent are the British even European, and what do they really gain by being a part of the European Union in the first place? And are they really part of the European Union with all of these exceptions that they already have?
Yes, well, the European Union is foremost a peace plan, really. That's why I'm wearing my gas mask shirt here, because you've got to remember that the context of European Union beginning is total war, right? Europe has ravaged itself, World War I and World War II. So they don't want to do that again. So that's why France and Germany get together. But so it's in a sense a political diplomatic maneuver. But at its core, really, it's an economic club. So that's what Britain's interested in the most. You can have an Anglo world, and you can have colonies around the planet, in Australia and most of Africa in the 1800s. But Britain cannot divorce itself from its geographic reality that's just 26 miles off the coast of Europe, at the continent. And so in terms of trade, our nearest neighbors are very important trading partners. And that's why Britain in 1973, I think it was, eventually voted to join the European Union, because it's such an advantageous economic grouping to be in, free trade. Ultimately, that's why Britain's in the EU, but not in some of these other things you're mentioning. Because it values its security. Like the Schengen thing is a passport. Britain wants to control its borders, and it's easier to do, of course, being an island nation, to do that. So Britain is picking and choosing core areas of the EU to be in, including not being in the euro, because Britain sees, again, more advantage to being economically independent, but still valuing free trade with the rest of Europe.
Yeah, and I guess part of what I wonder in terms of this is, would it be possible for Britain to negotiate? And of course, that's what we've seen with these negotiations that seem to go nowhere. Would it be possible for Britain to, to have an advantageous trade agreement with Europe, even if they're not part of the European Union? Because the United States, we trade a fair amount with Europe. Now, maybe not to the extent that the UK does, but as far as are those economic benefits like all or nothing based on being a part of the European Union? Or is, and that's where I guess we have to go into the difference between a soft Brexit and a hard Brexit, because we can't necessarily just think, okay, this is just, all or nothing. So are there some scenarios in which Britain can have those economic benefits without being in the European Union?
Well, other countries, Switzerland and Norway are similar in a sense that they are not in the EU, but they have a lot of the same economic benefits. But they don't have any say at all, in very little anyway, in EU rules, and can't influence the EU in the way that being in the member of the club can. So yes, that's one option, is a softer Brexit where Britain maintains its single market, so it has low tariffs and it keeps its trade benefits, but has no influence at all on any of the other laws passed. And so it's got to, in the EU, there's called the four freedoms. So the free movement of people, services, goods, and I think goods and information. And the EU has been very clear when it's negotiating. You can't cherry pick. You can't have one of the three and not the other, or three and miss out one. You've got to have all four, or none at all, because they don't want the other 27 countries thinking, okay, well, I'll have this one but not that one, and that would like fatally weaken the EU's position as a world power, economic power at least. So Britain could end up leaving as with a softer Brexit and have a customs union, but not have any. It'd be like you've got some of the benefits, but you've got none of the advantages of influencing the future direction of the EU, which is actually something Britain has done historically, is trying to take the EU more towards a free trade position. whereas some of the other continental powers, especially France, wants to take it away from free trade, kind of edging towards more of a mixed economy or socialist economy. And so Britain's role has been to try and push the EU back from that. But if they left the EU, then they wouldn't have any influence at all in that sense over the EU.
So I guess now first I want to say, Colin, that Riley and Maria and Julietta are saying that they're all watching because they have no AP Euro homework. So they're very thankful for that. But they're not doing your homework, so they're watching your broadcast here. So one thing, is there an effort? What would you like when I look at these negotiations? Britain is the second largest economy in the EU. And so what I'm wondering is some of this stalling on the EU side really an effort, because I hear what you're saying, that we can't send a signal to, nations that, and forgive me if I'm paraphrasing here, but, from the EU's perspective, if you allowed nations to only associate with the EU in ways that they find advantageous, then is the whole thing going to fall apart? Is there an effort on the EU side to kind of make an example of Britain, as far as why they can't seem to offer Britain a deal that can be taken nearly 3 years later? Does the EU need Britain more than Britain needs the EU?
Well, if you look at the trading purely from economics, the EU needs Britain less because it will suffer less. Britain will suffer more because it's a smaller market, so it will lose a lot more percentage-wise of its GDP and trade and things. I think there is a sense that amongst the EU that Britain is having to face up to the choice of its consequences, consequence of its choice, and in that they've left or they're trying to leave, and we need to let them decide what to do with that, but we can't help them make that choice. They've got to decide by themselves. And in a sense, the EU is not playing hardball, but it's saying, we're not really going to make this choice easy. You're right, because we don't want other countries to make the same choice. And actually, paradoxically, Britain leaving the EU has made the EU stronger because the other countries realize, wow, look at the mess going on over there. Do we really want to do that? And so in a sense, there's a new, you can see it in all sorts of various political movements and polls, and the EU has a great kind of citizen poll thing called Eurobarometer, where they take regular opinion polls of people's perspective. Is the EU a beneficial, is your country gain more or lose more from being in the EU? And since Brexit, the polls have been rising, where we have a more favorable view of the EU and its core emissions, because we see with the mess that Britain's going through. We don't want to do that. So I don't think the EU is playing hardball deliberately, but they're realizing that this is actually a thing that can strengthen the EU. How much we can't give in to Britain is actually a benefit in some sense for countries to realize if you're going to make this choice, you're going to have to live by it.
Okay, so that's, with that going, and let's think about this. Now, of course, there's the hard Brexit, like the no deal Brexit, and then there's this idea of a soft Brexit where they stay in the customs union, they have some kind of deal worked out. Now, of course, before we go on, what is this thing? Okay, so Theresa May's government has negotiated a deal, but nobody seems to like it. It's only a very small group of people. So there's been this deal that's been negotiated. And one thing you promised me, Colin, in the pre-chat is we can get into this backstop provision. Okay, so the biggest thing that's holding up Brexit, which was supposed to, if I'm not mistaken, supposed to have been concluded in February. That in February it was supposed to that Britain was supposed to leave with or without a deal, and then they've delayed it. And it seems to me like this backstop provision in Northern Ireland is the main thing holding it up. So what is the controversy over Theresa May's plan right now, and really why is it controversial with so many different people, including a lot of people in her own party?
All right, so here's where the proportion of the British Parliament matters, because the Conservative Party, this was just her party, does not have an absolute majority of MPs. She's reliant on a small group of Northern Ireland nationalist, loyal to Britain parties called the DUP, Democratic Unionist Party. And there's 10 of those MPs. And when you add those 10 to the Conservative MPs, then she has a majority. So if those 10 Northern Ireland nationalists decide not to vote with Theresa May, then her government will fall and they'll lose power. So she, in a sense, is tied to this agreement with this Northern Ireland Nationalist Party, and they do not want to have any type of agreement that severs them or even weakens them from being part of the United Kingdom. And there's definitely that's a core part of this whole Brexit vote, because the Good Friday agreements were initially, back in the late 90s, something to end the terrorism in Northern Ireland, and all sides agreed to it. And part of the helping of that easing of tension and kind of investment to return to Northern Ireland and the violence to end was an open border between the two parts of Ireland. Well, if you have Brexit, then Britain, because the Northern Ireland is in the UK, they will have to leave the customs union, and then you're going to have border controls again. And the rest of the EU said, no, we're never going to go back to that. And they've been very supportive of the Irish Prime Minister, whose name escapes me, it's a Gaelic name. And because they don't want any resurgence in the troubles in Northern Ireland, neither does Britain. Britain doesn't want that either. And the border, a hard border between the two parts of Ireland, would only increase that trouble. So you've got two opposite things that seem to not be possible to have both at the same time. The UK leaves the EU, and that means a hard border. But the EU is saying, no, 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 you can't have a hard border in Ireland, so you're going to have to accept a customs union. But the hard Brexit says, no, we don't want a customs union. So that's what the backstop.
Okay, so the thing is now, the Democratic Unionist Party, do they support a hard border?
Their overall goal is to keep Northern Ireland part of the United Kingdom. And they will do anything they can to see that happen. So if it comes to a hard border, if that's the only choice, they would rather have that than have their relationship with London and the rest of Britain weakened. So yes, they are willing to accept a hard border in order to stay part of the UK.
Okay, got it. And the thing is, though, if there's not a hard border, then isn't there basically like, does this, okay, so this kind of, to me, it seems like it almost defeats the purpose of Brexit if there's not any kind of hard border or border control there, because in that case, then somebody can just walk across the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland and they're in the UK, right?
Correct.
Okay, okay.
That's what many in the EU would like to see, that the Theresa May's government, the Conservatives, agree to the fact that for the rest of the United Kingdom, you can have a hard border, but for this one part in Ireland, you can't have a hard border, and you can trade freely back and forth. But that would then mean that Northern Ireland has a separate distinction from the rest of Britain, and that's like a thin end of a wedge that the DUP sees that if we start giving concessions, then sooner or later we'll end up with a united Ireland and we'll not be part of the UK anymore. So we can't give an inch. We've got to maintain the exact same arrangements as the rest of Britain.
Okay, got it. So for the DUP, it's like yeah, because they see this as almost a prelude to, okay, so I can understand what's going on there now. So that's good, because that one was getting a little bit beyond me. Now, Nigel Farage, okay, so he's back. Okay, he was a big part of this this whole Brexit thing, and he was the leader of the UK Independence Party, or UKIP. And so UKIP, in the previous European parliamentary election, elections. UKIP had a great showing in that. Of course, that was, kind of right before this Brexit thing came along. Now, of course, UKIP has gone, far right even for Farage. Like that's that saying, it's like when it comes down to it, Nigel Farage, I mean, he's certifiably right-wing nationalist, but there's kind of a line. Like Farage has always maintained, even though he's into theatrics, like at least some degree of respectability. So as far as it goes now, UKIP has moved a bit too far to the right for Farage, and now Farage has started this Brexit Party. And from what I can see here, now the Brexit Party was started only, this is very, very recent, just a few, let's see, when was this founded on? Okay, so it was founded technically in November, but then again, it says here that it was registered in February. So it's only about 3 months old. And this party is calling for a hard Brexit. That a no deal, even if there's a no deal Brexit, then that's what they're wanting. But then again, it looks like this party, Colin, could get 35% of the vote, possibly, who knows, maybe a little more than that. But it looks like, it's very, according to the polls, about 1 in 3 people that vote in the elections this week could be voting for the Brexit Party. In your view, how does that impact things if the Brexit Party, how strong of a showing would they have to have in order for this to, maybe nudge the Conservative Party on the Brexit question?
And some newspapers in Britain are portraying this as almost like a second referendum, right? And that the EU parliamentary elections, if there's a large number of parties who are against Brexit and the proportion and majority of voters vote for them, then that's like a proxy for, well, maybe we shouldn't have Brexit. And others think, well, what if, yes, like you're saying, what if the Brexit Party and other hard Brexit, other parties who agree with them, get a majority? Well, then that's clearly a sign that Britain should then definitely leave the EU as quickly as possible. And that's such a simplistic way of looking at it, because the Brexit Party is really just a protest vote, much like UKIP was. It's a one-issue party, right? Even in its name, Brexit. That's all they stand for. So they just Farage just wants to make sure Brexit happens. So the number of votes he gets, it's not that these people will convert and become supporters of Nigel Farage's party. Conservatives will vote for them. Labour Party will vote for them. Is it relevant how large their vote is? I don't really think it is, actually. It's more of a single issue protest vote.
Okay, so you don't think this will necessarily translate into, even let's say the Brexit Party passes 40% of the vote. You don't see it necessarily giving Theresa May's government a nudge here to kind of, go with the no deal Brexit.
No, I think it'll make no difference to her negotiations at all.
Okay, well, interesting. Now, also with her negotiations, now, when we talk about this as a second referendum, of course, Colin, there have been people that have called for a second referendum, like for there to be a confirmatory referendum. Now, I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Now, of course, to my audience, Colin is a native of Scotland, and we know that people in Scotland tend to be much more favorable toward the European Union, much less likely to support Brexit, which Colin can go into that as well. But one thing, I was watching a speech that Nigel Farage gave a couple of weeks ago, and it was really an interesting sort of point here, because what he's saying is they had this Brexit referendum in 2016, and then after that they tried to say, oh, well, maybe because it passed very narrowly. It was only, it was a very razor thin margin, but we've heard these things like, oh, the people didn't understand what they were voting for, in spite of the government, Cameron's government, having sent out something to everybody's mailbox saying, if you vote for Brexit, this is the stuff that could happen. And then he talks about like, okay, these people calling for a second referendum. That, for example, he brought up Turkey, where you had the mayoral elections in Istanbul, and Erdogan's Erdogan's sidekick didn't win that election, and now they're saying, oh, I think we need to do a revote of that election. And of course, all of the European countries, they're condemning that second that like you shouldn't be revoting because you had an election. So the thing is, it's like Cameron's government, they promised that referendum, and then we've got and of course I think the media has to a large extent, of course you've got different media outlets and that sort of thing, but to a large extent I wonder how much of this has just been because of the fear drummed up by the media that people, oh, this is just going to be a catastrophe. But how does somebody like what are your thoughts on a second referendum, and how is that like consistent with what we would think of as if we're thinking about European democracy, that there's already been a vote, and it seems like the government, which I question at this point whether Theresa May's government is really negotiating in good faith, or else if there's kind of a fifth column operation here, but does that referendum deserve to mean something that's already happened? I mean, I think I agree with you about this week's elections, because if you vote for the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, which is going to be about at least 30% of people in Britain, they're not really voting for Brexit or against Brexit when they do that. But, is there a reason to have a second referendum on Brexit? And would that be consistent with the principles of democracy and the promise of, a straight up referendum by Cameron's government?
Well, my answer would be a typical AP Euro answer, which is it's not that simple to say it's all one or all the other, right? There's nuance, okay? So there are many politicians in Britain, Nigel Farage, obvious example, who are saying, yes, you're denying the people's will by trying to subvert it and have a second, and let me tell you what's happening in Turkey, and this is what's going on. That's a position you can argue. I think it's a ridiculous position, to be honest, because it's been 3 years since the original election, and the original election referendum was over leaving the EU or not leaving the EU, but it didn't define any of the conditions of that, and the devil is in the details, right? So Brexit has often been compared to a divorce, an exceptionally messy divorce, where to two parties, one says, I would like a divorce, and the other party tacitly agrees, and it goes into negotiations. Well, it would seem to me that if negotiations drag out over a long time and you realize this is the type of divorce I'm going to get, I'm not going to get the house, I'm going to lose the kids, I'm going to lose the dog, this is going to be all negative, much worse than I thought, then isn't there an option for one of the parties to say, okay, that's just not what I thought I was getting in the first place when I made my first choice. So am I allowed then, isn't there a possibility that I can reconsider my initial action? And I think that's what the people who want a second referendum are saying. That the Brexit vote was so close that there's a significant doubt in many people's minds now over what type of Brexit, and is it worth it to pursue it now? And so therefore, it would seem on the other side of the coin, a legitimate democratic thing to say, that was 3 years ago, we didn't know the details then, now we do know the details, now we'll be more informed. If we did have a second vote, now we can make an informed choice. Isn't that the more democratic thing to do?
Okay, so in terms of now, what I might be hearing here is when we think about, could there be some kind of referendum between like a hard Brexit and this deal that's been worked out by May's government, where it's not necessarily like another, because I think I would agree with you there in the sense that when you had this check yes or no referendum, that there wasn't really a lot of, there's not a lot of details there. When somebody says, hey, I'm just not really pleased with the European Union right now. And so I'm going to vote this way. Now, what I would guess, though, is how can you really get into that kind of complexity in a democratic, a referendum? Would there possibly be three choices? Do we remain? Do we have a hard Brexit? Do we have a soft Brexit? But then when none of those gets the majority, then what do we do? How would a workable revote work in your view? Like, what would be something that would actually, okay, we can do this and this actually will be implemented and mean something?
Well, ultimately at the moment there's not a majority in Parliament, and it's come down to Parliament's decision. Parliament would have to say, it's not, regardless of the number of petitions, and there's been lots, millions of people have signed petitions for a second referendum, but it's ultimately up to Parliament to decide, should there be a second people's vote, or should Parliament decide? They can decide to do that, or they can decide not to do that and agree it amongst themselves. So I think there's two issues there. I do think that if Parliament is unable to agree on anything, and it's going, October 31st is the day that Brexit will happen, and the EU is pretty clear, we're not giving you any more extensions. So if we're getting into August, September, and there's still no, on the horizon, nothing evident of any type of agreement in a parliamentary majority on any type of action, if it's still a hung parliament in a sense, then I think you'll get mounting pressure on MPs to say, okay, you have been unable to deal with this because of your inability to deal with it. Then wouldn't it be logical to put the same question, exactly the same question, back to the electorate and have a simple yes, no? Now we know what Brexit is, or do we want to vote for it, yes or no? I think that's one way we could get a second referendum. Another way we could get a second referendum is that if some significant party leaders, particularly in the Labour Party, openly say, this is our party position now, we want to have a second referendum, then I think that's the more likely way to get a second referendum, because then you will have the SNP party, right? You'll have the DUP, perhaps. You'll have perhaps a majority, even some Conservatives too. You might have enough people voting with that bloc, and then they would be able to take over parliamentary control. They wouldn't be forming a government, but they'd be able to have a majority, and then they could pass forward a referendum bill that then everyone else could vote on. So I think that is increasingly the more likely scenario as we get into September, for example.
Okay, because we are getting to the point where it does, and that's another thing about when we think about European democracy. In certain American states, you have referendums and initiatives and stuff like that. But typically, in the European parliamentary model, the parliament will make most of these decisions. And we're seeing here kind of a failure on the part of the UK Parliament to do this. Okay, so there is a new date, October 31st, and we're being kind of promised again that this will happen at this time. So Colin, maybe we'll chat again in the in the fall and figure that out. Now, when it comes down to it, why should somebody in Britain, and especially it might not be a bad idea to kind of remind everyone about what is the difference between the way that Scots view this versus versus the majority of people in England. But what is it? What are the benefits as far as staying, what is the case for staying in the EU? Now, you did note, having the chance to influence EU policy, which, from your view, the British have more of an influence than they're claiming that they have, that they're having as much influence as they're having stuff put upon them. But what is really the case for having some kind of, continuing to have some kind of relationship with the European Union?
Well, it's a pretty straightforward one, and it really reflects what's going on here in the United States too. Do you want to be part and integrated in the global worldwide economy, especially in Europe, where, like you're saying, travel is so short distances between countries? You can see why the Netherlands would want to be it, and Belgium, but Scotland's not that far. It's an hour flight to Brussels. So it makes sense economically. Or do you want to put up barriers, cultural, immigration, trade barriers, which is what this would be. This would be effectively be like a tariff barrier between Britain and the rest of Europe. Do you want, is that the future that you want your country to take? And a very interesting articles, I sent you a couple, but one on The Economist this week is talking about this. It's no longer within parties in Britain and in Europe, it's no longer so easy a political spectrum. Here's the left-wing parties, here's the center parties, here's the right-wing parties. Has politics become in Europe an extent of here's the urban party and here's the rural party, right? And they have different values, they have different perceptions of the world, and what path do you want your country to take? Do you want to be integrated or do you want to be more isolated? And that's ultimately what Britain has to choose.
Okay, got you. And so yeah, I put a link in the chat to this article that Colin's talking about. I think of course it may be, oh, you got to register to read the article in full. Doesn't look like you have to necessarily subscribe. They just want you to register to read the full thing here.
So The Economist is a great magazine to subscribe to, I have to say that.
Okay, yeah, I may have to, you know, because I've looked into it before. Now, of course, The Economist tends to come from a, you know, globalizing, more liberal perspective. But of course, I think that we're, you know, and I mean by European liberal, like international liberal for people watching in the United States. We have to be clear on some of that stuff. But yeah, this is something, of course, I see, you know, some of those, like when we think about the United States and politics, the difference between urban and rural interest. So that's something that we'll see with that. And of course, you know, we've got these questions of European and national identity, which is one of the things that we emphasize in the AP Euro course. And of course, you know, in Britain, Euroscepticism is very strong there, stronger than in some places, I think, because, you know, you do have, even though they're close by, that obvious like separation from Europe with the, you know, with the English Channel. But at the same time, you know, certainly they're, you know, in a lot of ways dependent on that European economy. So, you know, interesting to have you on here with this, Colin. You know, I would see if I got some good questions from the chat, but I think that, you know, they're saying stuff like, you know, the United States needs to turn Europe into a colony or something like that. I'm not quite. Oh, and Riley says that you are an avid Economist reader. She's still watching. So that's good that your students are paying attention here. Colin, anything else that people might want to know going into these elections this week? Something to watch for in particular when these returns are coming in. Now, of course, from your perspective, you know, we're already, you know, from your perspective, this election doesn't really matter all that much anyway in terms of policy, but anything that people might want to look for as they're watching these election results come in a few days.
So we've talked, and I see why we've done this, but we've talked almost exclusively about Britain and Brexit and how it's affecting Britain. But the EU, it's definitely affecting the EU as well. And there's a bigger issue maybe. Well, here's one thing to bear in mind. The EU parliamentary elections are the second largest democratic exercise in the world, right? So that India has the largest democracy in the world, but the second largest democratic exercise is when the EU Parliament votes, right? So it's important world event, right? Because people get a say, and what they're voting for in Europe, there's a perception that populism and nationalism is sweeping through. There's a great article that Time did recently. I guess I linked to that too, and it's making a kind of almost like a doomsday prediction that all these nationalist parties, like Farage, like in Poland and Hungary, and Spain. I don't know if you're aware of that, right? Spain recently had an election, an internal Spanish election, where there was a neo-fascist right-wing party called Vox who have got more votes, and for the first time since the Spanish Civil War. Or since Franco, anyway. So there's this, seems to be this wave of populism and nationalism, and that's going to surface all over Europe and break apart the EU, much like Brexit's threatening to take Britain out. But if you ask, and again, one of the articles I sent you is about 5 myths about this election. if you actually poll people and ask them, is migration and immigration and national identity the top issue, then it is only the case for 15% of voters. So I don't think you're seeing Europe splintering apart. I think you're actually seeing voters concerned with the economy more. You're seeing voters concerned. The top issue in that poll, in fact, was Islamic radicalism. So they're worried about terrorism, right? So that's across Europe. And then it's an economic issue. So Brexit is having an effect on Europe in two ways. It's having a positive effect on people who don't want populism and nationalism, because they're realizing there are core European values that we do like. We feel more European than we did 3 years ago, because we see the opposite in Britain, and that's causing us to reflect on what values do we hold more dearly. And so there's a rise of centrist parties that are becoming almost like pan-European. So that's an interesting effect. Brexit is having a positive effect on the Europeanness in a sense. And I think it's similar in the economy. They're realizing that Britain is making a bad economic choice, and we want to not make the same choice in Greece or anywhere else, right? We're going to tie our economic future to a European economy. So yes, it's having a big effect on Britain, but it's in a sense having positive effects on European identity and on European economy. And I would just point that out. I think you'll see at these elections not as many nationalist or populist party votes as you might think might happen.
Okay, yeah, and actually, you know, and of course we're talking about Britain here, but you know, as you noted, this is a European election, and that's another dimension of that, which I didn't even realize that in France, you know, the National Front has actually just rebranded itself in the last year as the National Rally. So now they're, you know, so they're trying to shed that old like far right image and make their brand of populism mainstream. Now, the latest polls in France seem to indicate that now, of course, there are a lot of different parties running in France. It looks like there are over 10 of them, but it looks like the National Front is going to, you know, going to be the top vote-getting party. But then again, with all these different parties, I mean, that's only going to be about 25%. So it's going to be interesting. So I think what we need to look at, and what I'm glad you said here, is not only the results in Britain and what that means for Brexit, but also keeping track of these voting blocks in the European Parliament and seeing what, you know, in France and Poland and some of these other members of the EU, what is it going to, you know, what is the next European Parliament going to look like? Because I'm kind of wondering here, are we reaching, you know, Europe ever since the you know, the end of the Cold War has been integrating and integrating and integrating, and not only from Britain, but it seems like you could have a relatively, you know, a rather large voting bloc in the European Parliament, with or without Britain, that is really trying to not necessarily destroy the European Union, but perhaps try to walk back some of the integration, you know, in favor of more national policies.
Yes, I mean, that's definitely true. It's truer than it's been in the past, but is that going to break apart the EU? I don't think so, because not only if you're a middle of the road European voter in Lower Saxony in Germany or something, and you're not left wing or right wing, you can, right, here's what you're looking at. Do we want to go down the path of Brexit? Are we concerned with the rise in power of China and their authoritarian government, right? What about Putin's Russia? Is that a model we should follow, right? We're looking at Turkey. Is that where we want to go there, right? A kind of oligarchy and, you know, authoritarian. And then we look at tariffs, and that's happening in the United States. And, you know, many Europeans do not like what Donald Trump is doing at all. So if you're a European, you're like, well, we don't like these other examples. So that's going to reinforce our commonality about, you know, yes, we have nationalists and populists in Europe, but we still have these core European values that bring us together and strengthen us. And so I think the EU will continue. I think it will, if anything, get a little bit stronger from all these crises that it's weathered. and it'll get stronger because it has to, because it doesn't want to take these other paths of other big powers that it sees.
Yeah, and that's of course the big question going on, I think, as you're noting in the West right now. Because I tell you, I went to Turkey during spring break, and I was pretty impressed. Now, of course, I didn't try to go out there and criticize the government or anything like that. But as far as what you were saying, on the economic issue,
Armenia.
What's that?
Did you ask anyone? Did you ask anyone about Armenia?
No, and I didn't try to look that up on Wikipedia either. Their Wikipedia is like a look. It is not exactly the same here. Yeah, because they don't want people Googling the Armenian genocide or other stuff that allegedly didn't happen. So it is not a country that is on the same page as Europe when it comes to civil liberties, but the economy, they've got this brand new airport in Istanbul. It looks like their economy is doing well. Their country's on the rise. And so I think the thing is here at the end of the day, you do kind of have these two paths, whether you're in the United States, you look at the United States, Turkey, Russia, some of these countries that are, on this more nationalist path, what direction will Britain take? But yeah, as far as continental Europe, I don't think the EU is going anywhere. So it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. And I just got a text message from my wife. I think my daughter is looking for me to come tuck her in or something like that, which she needs to be asleep now anyway, but might need to go do that. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, very much thank you, Mr. Colin Baker from Blacksburg High School, who's always joining me for these annual or semi-annual. We'll see if we get together again in the fall when the next deadline comes up, because it's always cool to look at this. What's that?
It's Reformation Day, October 31st.
Yes, Reformation Day. So by All Saints Day, maybe this will be concluded. So so Colin, thanks again for joining me. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, and it's always a pleasure, everybody.